I'd like to introduce Rajat Agarwal. Rajat, hopefully you're there.
I am, and Parul, thank you so much for having me here.
Great to have you here. For those of you who don't know, Rajat of course, comes from a serious journalism background, but currently in his current avatar, since it seems to be a day we spend a lot of time talking about avatars. In this current avatar, he is senior communications manager, lead digital communications, and editor of Microsoft Stories India. And Microsoft Stories, as we know, it's a really serious bit of own media programming with solid journalistic values. So I'm really looking forward, Rajat, to hearing about your experience with own media. Anybody who has questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box. And if you had questions for Megha, which you were not able to get answered, please put those questions as well. We will do our best to have them answered well in time. Rajat, with Microsoft Stories, and we heard a bit of that from Sanjam as well about how they approach Flipkart Stories. So, what do you think is the central key point of having a successful own media platform which really interests the audience?
Thank you so much for that question, Parul. And that is something that we grapple with every day. It's been about 5 years for me at Microsoft Stories, running Stories. And when I joined, it was all about what is this platform going to be about. And one of the things that was very clear to us from day one is that this platform is not going to be about Microsoft. It's not about brands. It's not about what we are doing, but more so about the mission statement that we have, which is to empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more. So what we did was we took those two bits, right? People and organizations, and we focus our stories, majority of our stories on that. So if you see the kind of stories that we do, they're always about people, or mostly about people, or organizations that are making an impact in this world. And Microsoft comes in just as an enabler. So the story is never about Microsoft. And I think that is one thing, with own storytelling. And I think Sanjan put it very nicely when he said that when they started Flipkart Stories, they were very clear. It's not going to be a blog. It's not going to be just a new site for publishing press releases, but it's going to be a storytelling platform. And what are stories really, right? I mean, these are things that people are interested to read, and that was the basic premise. And that is where I think we differentiate ourselves over own storytelling that a lot of other brands do, is that our storytelling is about people. It's not about us. It's about topics that people would love to read about. So think of it as stories that you would read in the weekend edition of a newspaper or a feature magazine. Tuhina spoke about, long form, right? It still has its own charm. We are sort of keeping that alive with our storytelling. And some of the things that, triggered why we do our own storytelling or Microsoft Stories is the fact that the media in itself had stopped telling great stories. The media environment right now is they're all chasing news. But like Karan mentioned, right, he spoke about this 19-year-old kid selling sneakers, right? That story would not have ever been covered in the media had it not come on social media, right? So similarly, if you think of organizations, there are so many stories out there that we want to talk about, but there is no space in the media for those kind of stories. So that is another way we use Microsoft Stories. So the idea is that the media might not be interested in covering that story till the time we talk about it, and then suddenly everyone's interested to talk about that story.
That's really interesting. I keep coming back to Sanjam because he shared so much details. He mentioned that they took a very, very SEO oriented approach. Do you think that approach is a must for own media?
I think SEO is important for certain things. So, for instance, he spoke about Flipkart fraud, right? I mean, there are certain topics that you want to own the narrative, right? And if you search for it on a search engine, and it does not appear in the top couple of links, you've lost the narrative, right? I mean, then it is whatever others are talking about, that is what people would hear. In that respect, I think SEO is very, very important. But then there is another element, which is storytelling, right? And where I do not think SEO is as important as story, right? I mean, he also spoke about a lot of elements of storytelling that they follow. We do the same, right? So there is the build up, right? There is the conflict, there is a resolution. So we look at those aspects more closely when it comes to storytelling. We look at the visuals, for instance, right? So what does the story look like? Because that is what people are going to see on social media when you share it. How is the story written, right? So we do not do a lot of corporate speak. We do not do a lot of jargon. It is storytelling from a humanist perspective, right? Another thing that I feel is very, very important, and that is what a lot of brands tend to miss, and we have been guilty of that too, is the fact that we are so immersed in what's happening internally that we forget what is it that would make sense for your audience, right? And I think Karan mentioned that knowing your audience is important, and that is true for us as well. So more than SEO, we want to know what is it that our audience is interested at any given point of time, right? So for instance, we knew that there are certain moments coming up, and this was last year, right? And we did a few stories around sustainability, right? So we had a story about a startup that we work with that does replaceable batteries for e-rickshaws, right? And we told that story from the perspective of a rickshaw driver, right? So the lead images of that rickshaw driver in his auto rickshaw, him talking about how shifting to an e-rickshaw has saved his time. He's out on the road more because he does not have to wait to charge his rickshaw, but he can simply swap it. And then we come to the company behind it and how they do it, and where does Microsoft come into the picture. Now, this is a story that the World Economic Forum picked up for its Davos agenda, right? And you cannot pitch stories. Any comms person would know that you can't pitch a company story to the World Economic Forum, right? Similarly, we had done a story around another startup that is doing e-waste management and how they're doing. And we actually went to the center of Delhi, where all e-waste from across the country sort of comes over. And we have these beautiful images of people working with piles of e-waste out there, right? And segregating that. And that is the photograph that captures your attention. And again, the World Economic Forum picked it up, our leadership picked it up. So I would say more than SEO when it comes to storytelling, you need to think about the stories that people would be interested in reading, the visuals and how you tell the story. And of course, SEO has its place, which is for more critical issues management than anything else when it comes to a branded content or an own channel like ours.
So thanks, Rajat. I think the very fact that the hero image was a cycle rickshaw driver and not the CEO of the company, which makes those, is such a game changer. I think it's a real game changer. And keeping that in mind, Rajat, what do you think are the kind of skill sets which are required? Clearly you're a journalist who's moved to this kind of work. What kind of skill sets are required for the team who runs this kind of? Does it also require the ability to push back and say no? That's very brochure-like. We're not having that.
Yeah. So, great point that you bring up. And, of course, having that journalistic background helps because one, I think that gives us an edge over what is it that would be of interest rather than what is it that we want to tell as a company, right? And those two skills, I think, I would be amiss if I do not sort of bring in all of the colleagues of mine, at Microsoft, and all of them are senior, seasoned comms professionals. They sort of, act as a guardrail. So it's not an either or sort of a skill set. But I think having that nose for news really helps. Having that vision to be able to visualize what that story is going to be like, right? I think that again is very critical. And, going away from what is it that you would typically put out as a press release. And like you mentioned, the ability to push back. So I kid you not, every year I would possibly get about requests for 100 odd stories, that, hey, I have this interesting customer, and we need to do a story about them. And I would ask them, so great, you have that customer. So what's the story? Right. And there is no story out there. So yeah, pushing back is a skill. And especially for someone like me, for whom Microsoft is the first corporate gig that I've ever done, I think pushing back comes easier to me. I would say not having that baggage. But it boils down to being able to tell stories that matter and stories that are impactful rather than telling every story that comes your way.
That's really important, actually. That understanding is very important. And I think a communicator's audience does know that very well. Coming back to the traditional peso model, as they, Microsoft Stories, if I were to traditionally define it, it's under the own media bracket. But could you help us, and I think the audience would also be interested in the insight, that how are the stories themselves leveraged across the platform?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is a muscle that we have built over the years. What we do is the stories that I create, we treat them at some level as content assets as well, right? So whenever there's a story in the works, we come out with a complete plan. This would include how are we going to approach earned media for this? So is it something that we're going to pitch to a journalist before the story goes live? We obviously have our social media channels. How is the story going to play up there? How is it that our leaders are going to use these stories on their social media presence? How are they going to use it? Say if they are participating at an event and they want to give examples, how are they going to use it there? And of course, paid media, right? I think creating content is just one part of what we do. It's also about how do you give that story the legs so that it is appreciated by a lot more people. Sanjan did throw in some numbers. I can safely say that we are bigger than the numbers that he had thrown up for Flipkart Stories. I think in terms of earned media coverage, we've had great success over there.
My next question is really about resource allocation. I mean, some might unfairly or fairly argue that Microsoft has resources to do all this. But do you think this is something which definitely requires, I mean, Sanjam did say that you require resources if you want to do it properly. It's not something which can be done overnight and say, let me do 10 blogs and try.
Yeah, absolutely. I think more than resources, I think it needs a vision. And if you're clear about what is it that you want to do, there are ways to make it work, and especially, people might think that I work with a lot of budgets. Let me just sort of clarify that I don't have a lot of budgets to play with. It's about how you make that money travel the distance, without sort of disclosing how we do it, the secret sauce, so to say. But, there are multiple models. So like Sanjay mentioned, right? I mean, they created an entire newsroom. I think that is one way to go about it. The other way to go about it is to not create that newsroom as such, with full-time resources, but do it smartly. And that is where I believe having that journalistic approach helps, because as journalists, while we were in the media, we never had budgets, right? So this, moving to Microsoft, coming into Microsoft and realizing that I have budgets was like, wow, this is like my dream come true. So I think it's doable. What I believe is that you need to start somewhere. And it's taken us years to fine tune that model. We have tried a lot of different things. We have tried going with agencies. We have tried doing it on our own. We have tried a hybrid model. We've given everything a try and then fine tune what really works for us. I think right now we are in that stage wherein we are pretty comfortable with what's working for us. We have a number of writers. We have the capabilities to do shoots across India. I think do not get dissuaded by the fact that, or the impression that it takes a lot of money. I think start small, build it up. And another thing is that you need sponsorship from your stakeholders, convincing them. It took me almost 3 years to even make people understand within Microsoft what is it that I do. That this is not case study, this is not a blog post, this is storytelling. So it takes time, but you need to start somewhere, because that is the only way that we can tell stories that are important to us as brands, and tell those stories authentically, so that the audience believes what you are talking about.
My final question for you, Rajat, is about this whole experiential content, metaverse, AI bit of it. Microsoft is certainly not short on experience on that, because some of the gaming part of the work that you do is very immersive. It has avatars. So it's not a new experience for Microsoft. But from like I'm not sure where you would drop this, in which vertical you would drop it. But coming from a communication point of view, do you see that as something experiential content being built by communicators?
That metaverse is still early days. We do not really know what it is going to be like. A lot of brands are, talking about events in metaverse and stuff, but it's mostly AR, VR kind of a world right now. I think we are still in very early stages as communicators to see what is it that we can do. And another thing is that, where do you draw the line between communications and marketing, right? Wherein, what is the additional experiential benefit that you give to journalists, right, or your audiences, that would increase the coverage that you get, that increases your share of voice and your brand recall. So, those are the things that I would grapple as a communicator. But it's going to be a fascinating space, nevertheless. I mean, we have seen the whole AR, VR trend from a storytelling perspective. You did have those short videos, those short documentaries on AR, but those were more of a fad. So it's still wait and watch for me. I would still look at preserving the limited budgets that I have, and do conventional text, image, video storytelling before jumping onto AI or metaverse right now.
That's, I think, a very sensible answer, and probably what people believe, though they like to, nobody likes to say that they're not cool with metaverse, but the truth is somewhere in the budgets and what kind of storytelling you can do best. With that, Rajat, thank you so much for your time. Any questions that come in, I'll direct them to you via email now. I know that we've taken a lot of your time today. It's been delayed a lot. Thank you so much, Rajat, for your time. My takeaways from you is actually, the whole how to make the newsroom work requires strategy, rather than just thinking money, and making your money travel in the best way that you can do it, and truly understand storytelling instead of corporate telling is what